It's now my pleasure to welcome the first keynote speaker for the ACFID Conference 2018. Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher AM was appointed as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission in July 2017, after 7.5 years as President of the Australian Law Reform Commission. In 2014, she was acknowledged for her contribution to public policy as one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence and was awarded the Australian Women's Lawyers Award. In the Australia Day Honours List 2015, Professor Croucher was made a member of the Order of Australia. 2016, Macquarie University conferred on her the title of Emeritus Professor. And in 2018, UNSW conferred on her an honorary LLD. Rosalind will reflect on the state of human rights in the world today, 70 years on from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Welcome, Rosalind.
Thank you, Susan, for that very warm welcome. And thank you, Dr. Peter Mackenzie, for the very warm welcome to country. I love the tradition that we have in this country of welcoming, and then for speakers, in turn, to respond by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and to pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge any Indigenous guests who are attending today. I think Susan and I reflected on the summary quality of the day and decided to also channel rainbow lorikeets in our green and orange jackets. It's wonderful for me to come back to UNSW campus. Susan mentioned that I had the honour of receiving an honorary degree here a few months ago, but I also spent 7 very happy years on the staff of the law faculty, and it's a very special place for me to come back. The campus is completely transformed in the meantime for any of you that are familiar with this place. But I also did my PhD here, so I've spent a lot of time on this campus. So the Scientia Centre is a wonderful place to return. And it's excellent to have representatives also of government to join us today, because one of the things I will be speaking about in my themes is about the important partnership. I think, Phil, you were speaking of partnerships and the importance of that in your opening remarks as well. But the partnership between the Australian Human Rights Commission as the national human rights institution in Australia, between our government, both in its departments and in its parliamentarians, and also civil society. And today, the biggest component of that is civil society. So, the theme of this conference is an aspirational one in terms of people, planet, peace. And in my remarks, I wanted to pick up especially the aspirational side of the theme and the element of people, because I want to take us back in this important year, which is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to some of the aspirations with which our human rights journey began collectively in the wake of the Holocaust and the cataclysm of the Second World War, to embark upon a commitment to universal goals, to a universal declaration of human rights based on the individual and the linking idea of all human beings being entitled to dignity and with it respect. Dignity is the thing that links all of our human rights obligations, and the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID, and each of your member organisations exemplifies the best of the Australian spirit that respects dignity and getting in there to make a difference where it is most needed. The work you do is important and necessary, and the part in promoting and protecting human rights, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in conflict zones and some of the more troubled areas of the globe. You are the public face of the Australian community giving back to the world. So I am deeply honoured to be delivering this opening address for your national conference, especially in this special birthday year for the Universal Declaration. And I hope by using the Universal Declaration as a point of reflection, I may set the scene for your important conference. Susan also mentioned the 25th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and the programme of action that accompanied it, which was adopted by the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna on 25th of June 1993. That same year, so it's another 25th anniversary, was the endorsement of what's known as the Paris Principles, which emerged out of a conference in Paris and sought to set what the benchmark should be for national human rights institutions as independent bodies with a strong voice and an independent mandate. It's also the marking of Australia's first year on the Human Rights Council, so some good aspirational benchmarks to open our conference. I thought, and I'm a legal historian, so when I took on the role at the Human Rights Commission, I wanted to find out the stories of human rights, the stories of the people. People was an emphasis, I think, Phil, in your remarks, the importance of people in changing the world, the importance of individuals getting together, both to share things in formal ways like universal declarations, but also on the ground, making a practical difference to the individuals whose human rights have been offended. So I'm going to take us to the old lady, the grand old lady of human rights worlds, which is the Universal Declaration. I call it the grand old lady because today I want to channel Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was recently widowed, and she took on the most important role. She was elected chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. And that body was given the job of drafting an international bill of human rights. They managed to achieve part of that. They managed to get a universal declaration adopted by the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948, but the other part of that international Bill of Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, took a few more years because after 1948 there was a matter of deteriorating relationships between the East and the West, the Cold War, and that meant that the other components of the International Bill of Human Rights took until the 60s to be adopted by the General Assembly and then to the 1970s before they entered into force. But the story of the making of the Universal Declaration is a fascinating one. I will share but a snippet of it today. It was a considerable achievement to bring together the different philosophical traditions of the members of that Commission on Human Rights into a final draft and into one that was accepted by the General Assembly. The 18 members of that commission were a remarkable group of people with strong convictions and strong personalities, including some of the most able and colourful figures of the time. I will give you some examples. There was Charles Malik, the Commission's Lebanese rapporteur, who was a philosophy professor turned diplomat, and the chief spokesman for the Arab League during the Palestine crisis. There was Professor René Cassin, a law professor and ardent Zionist who had lost 29 relatives in concentration camps and who had served as Charles de Gaulle's wartime legal advisor. There was Peng Chun-Chang, the Commission's vice chairman, a Chinese philosopher, a diplomat and playwright, who contributed a Confucian sensibility to the drafting. Mrs. Hansa Mehta, a veteran of India's struggle for independence and a tireless advocate for women's equality. And a bit of a dark horse was Alexei Pavlov, nephew of the famed conditioned reflex scientist, as in Pavlovian or Pavlov response, a powerful orator who we now know was under instructions from Moscow to obstruct and delay the proceedings. Anyway, Mrs. Roosevelt and a smaller drafting committee broke the back of the initial tasks, but hers was a key role. Reflecting now on the diversity of the group and how she did it, I can only conclude that she was a marvellous chair, and it is a fine art. But it is not all discipline. It involves building respectful relationships, which in a way is a practical expression of the founding idea of dignity and respect in the conventions themselves. This is how she did it. Immediately after the conclusion of the first session, she invited the drafting group to her apartment on the weekend for afternoon tea. And, as she said, as they settled down over the teacups, a heated philosophical discussion got underway. Dr. Chang asserted the importance of basing the Declaration on more than Western ideas. Dr. Malek expounded at some length the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. After a time, Mrs. Roosevelt said, "I could not follow them. So lofty had the conversation become. So I simply filled the teacups again and sat back to be entertained by the talk of these learned gentlemen." The Declaration, a universal language of human rights, was passed on the 10th of December, 1948, in Paris. Perhaps no other document in history has so beautifully encapsulated the aspiration of what we can all achieve as human beings, as has the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let me quote a paragraph from the preamble and the famous first article. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. All human beings are born equal and in dignity, free and equal, in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. We would do well in the 21st century to implement the Declaration faithfully, in intent and in spirit. Australia, as many of you will know, played a critical role in the development of the Declaration. Most well known is the role of Doc Evatt, as he was known, as the President of the General Assembly at the time. We earned then a reputation as an international good citizen for our commitment to human rights and to multilateralism. We should not forget this. It is something we should reflect on as we celebrate this anniversary of the Declaration, how significant our expressions of support for multilateral solutions can be in a world that is often fractured and is increasingly tribal in its politics. Just as we played an important role in the Universal Declaration, we played an equally important one in the Vienna World Conference 25 years ago. That conference and programme of action focused on turning the commitments of the UDHR into action. Its preamble recalled, in the way that UN documents tend to do, it's the sort of internalised footnotes. It recalled the determination expressed in the preamble and charter of the United Nations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, to practice tolerance and good neighbourliness, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. This is enduring and timeless language. It led to the creation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, providing the machinery for the UN to engage more robustly in human rights matters. It highlighted the importance of gender equality and the problem of violence against women, which led 2 years later to a landmark conference in Beijing and a platform of action. The conference was also the springboard for the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. It led to the establishment of the International Decade for the world's Indigenous people. And 3 years later, it did achieve its major goal, the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. The Vienna Conference was also critical in the promotion of the rights of children, with a goal of universal ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by 1995 being among the outcomes of the conference. That treaty is the most ratified of all human rights treaties, with just 2 countries yet to adopt it, Somalia and the USA. Australia, over the last 25 years, has been one of the key champions of national human rights institutions globally. This commitment has been unwavering, regardless of what political party is in power. It has been a key feature of development and diplomacy efforts, and technical cooperation to establish NHRIs has received significant support. For 20 years, for instance, the Australian Human Rights Commission has been supported by DFAT in human rights dialogues with China, as one illustration. Indeed, the support for NHRIs has been a key signature policy of Australia and one of the 5 pillars on which the bid for the election to the UN Human Rights Council was based. In its note verbale to the UN General Assembly, Australia said, "Independent national human rights institutions and a strong and robust civil society play a crucial role in preserving and advancing human rights. Australia is a strong advocate for strengthening the capacity of national human rights institutions to promote and protect human rights. In this statement, the Australian government acknowledged to the world the important role that bodies like the Australian Human Rights Commission and you, as civil society organisations, play in promoting, protecting, and indeed advancing human rights. This commitment of the Australian government leads to one of the more unusual dynamics in the relationship between the Australian Human Rights Commission and the government of the day. For the Commission is critical to the good reputation of Australia in the UN system and is constantly referred to by governments over the years in international processes, like treaty reporting moments, as a marker of the health of our own democratic traditions. This is even at times when domestically our plain speaking is less welcome. These are what I have dubbed blowtorch moments. In a speech I gave in October last year at the International Bar Association conference in Sydney, I coined this expression. I said this: having a devil's advocate for human rights, that is the Commission, is a healthy, indeed necessary thing in the context of the promotion and protection of those rights, even if it means we should expect criticism for calling out government against the commitments made to the international community in signing up to the international treaties that set the benchmark for human rights, even if it means the government sees us more of the devil's blowtorch than the devil's advocate. So let's now fast forward to 2018, bypassing but not forgetting a range of other significant moments. The creation of the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, and building on these, the Sustainable Development Goals that came into effect in January 2016, with its commitment to leave no one behind. How are we now placed? There are many ways in which Australia continues to be a valuable contributor in multilateral efforts and UN processes. We have shown that when we step up and are actively engaged in the UN, we add value. Whether as one of the last chairs of the UN Commission on Human Rights before it became the Human Rights Council, as a temporary member of the UN Security Council in peacekeeping efforts in our region, and in contributing to seminal reforms such as the creation of the International Criminal Court and the adoption of the Rome Statute, which established it. The pity is that we only step up sporadically. It has been, for example, nearly 10 years before we nominated to be on the Human Rights Council, and we have extremely low representation of Australians as independent experts within the UN system. There are examples of current people, including the election of Rosemary K.S. of the University of New South Wales to the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a committee formerly chaired by Emeritus Professor Ron McCallum. And another Australian, Liz Broderick, former Sex Discrimination Commissioner, is a member of the working group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice. But there aren't many Aussies in that world, in places where we can have a real impact. My hope is that our membership on the UN Human Rights Council will reinvigorate our engagement at the highest levels and validate the proposition that our participation enhances our best interests as a nation as well as those of our region. Other things on the 21st century radar. First, the entire Commonwealth of Nations has moved forward by introducing comprehensive human rights protections in legislation, commonly referred to as a Charter of Rights or a Human Rights Act. We stand alone in the Commonwealth for not having introduced such protection. Whether we introduce one, what it might look like, and what role the Human Rights Commission will play are key questions. A Human Rights Act builds a dialogue model for the protection of human rights. It requires parliaments to grapple with the issue of protection of human rights, and particularly to identify where the Parliament intends to deviate from such protection or breach the human rights of people or a subgroup in the community. Human Rights Acts do not trump the will of Parliament. They require a dialogue and a consideration of human rights. While we don't have a Human Rights Act, there is a need to produce what is called a compatibility statement with human rights, required since 2011 and the establishment of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. But the framework is incomplete for protecting human rights in Australia. Some of it, though, is invisible. Since 1981, when the very first iteration of the Australian Human Rights Commission was established, the Commission then was given a right to handle complaints under conventions such as the ICCPR. That role continues today. So even though there is not reference to an Australian Human Rights Act, the Human Rights Commission takes complaints that are founded on the ICCPR and the other conventions that are attached as schedules to our Act. But that complaint handling process, based on conciliation, can, at most, end in recommendations that come from me, essentially as President, that are unenforceable and have no recourse to a pathway that may involve judicial consideration. It is a problem in the development of the Commission, which is like a house which has a particular architectural framework, but one of the key components was never built. When the 1986 version of the Commission was before Parliament, and that's the present Commission of which I'm President, at the heart of that structure was an Australian Bill of Rights Act. It passed the representatives, but did not pass the Senate. But the rest of the design was passed, hence the ability to continue hearing complaints based directly on those treaties within our domestic framework, but in an invisible way, and ways that don't lead to enforceable recommendations. There is also inconsistency in our discrimination legislation, and as a previous law reformer, I can see lots of opportunities for a good broom going through the statute book in relation to such matters. So, there is much that can be done to improve the effectiveness of the domestic human rights architecture. In the final moments of my presentation, I want to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1 reminds us that beneath our clothes and despite our geographic location or where we are born, we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. The Declaration also concludes in Article 29 with the corollary of this, that everyone is also responsible for human rights. How do we enliven this idea that human rights are everyone's responsibility? To me, it is about increasing the rights-mindedness of people across the nation, across generations, and across all aspects of government. Or in terms of the Australian Human Rights Commission's motif, making human rights about everyone, everywhere, every day. Not just for government to deal with, or that is solely a matter for legal processes. My hope is that government, civil society, NGOs, the Commission will all work together to articulate what needs to be done and to commit to partnership to achieve it. In closing, I return to my channeling of my favourite person this year, Eleanor Roosevelt. In her private sphere, the world of her own conscience, so prized by Dr. Chang. And as a woman of faith, she prayed daily. And this is what she said. It is a prayer that has universal secular appeal to whomever one seeks for guidance. Our Father, who has set a restlessness in our hearts and made us all seekers after that which we can never fully find, forbid us to be satisfied with what we make of life. Draw us from base content and set our eyes on far-off goals. Keep us at tasks too hard for us, that we may be driven to you for strength. Deliver us from fretfulness and self-pitying. Make us sure of the good we cannot see and of the hidden good in the world. Open our eyes to simple beauty all around us, and our hearts to the loveliness men hide from us because we do not try to understand them. Save us from ourselves and show us a vision of the world made new. Thank you for allowing me the honour of presenting the address today. Like Mrs. Roosevelt, we should continue, both as the NHRI and as civil society, to set our eyes on far-off goals and help foster that vision of a world made new. Thank you.
Well, I think the sustained applause says it all. I want to thank you, Rosalind, for drawing a broad canvas across time, cultures and practice, providing us with an overview of Australia's global contribution over time, but also its current human rights architecture, of reminding us that human rights are about everyone, everywhere, every day, great phrase, and that it's the responsibility of all of us to realise human rights. ACFID shares the commitment of the Australian Commission for Human Rights to realising this aspiration within Australia and internationally. There's a very small token of our thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.